He did everything right. Stable job, paid mortgage, growing equity. The house was supposed to be the safest part of his life. 12 months after one decision, the house was still standing. His savings were not. There was no market crash, no reckless gamble, no sudden emergency. He simply turned his home into something it was never meant to be, a financial obligation that did not stop breathing. Elias Thorne had $800,000 in home equity. 12 months later, his liquid cash was entirely gone. There was no job loss, no speculation, no dramatic collapse. He was disciplined, careful, rational. He made a decision that looked responsible at the time. He simply looked at the stable foundation of his life and decided it was too quiet. But he misunderstood the mechanics of his own structure. The market did not betray him. The math did not fail. His house simply changed roles. He unlocked the value inside his walls and put it to work, believing it would behave like cash. He did not realize he had permanently converted his shelter into an active, unforgiving creditor. Welcome to the Financial Autopsy. This archive does not examine how wealth is built. It documents how financial structures fail under pressure. We do not judge the operator. We isolate the decision, the assumption, and the mechanical chain of consequences that follows. Step inside the physical space of his achievement. Heavy oak floors absorb his footsteps. The HVAC hum cycles quietly beneath vaulted ceilings. The lighting is controlled and subdued. This is a middle-class fortress, stable, insulated, and designed to feel permanently safe. But for a man trained to eliminate inefficiency, absolute safety eventually begins to look like waste. Elias spent his days optimizing systems and removing idle capacity. Alone in his living room, the quiet stopped feeling like peace. It started feeling like unused capital. He stopped seeing drywall and polished wood. He saw $800,000 trapped in the walls. He decided the house needed a job. Procedural access to this file remains active below. Maintain clearance within the archive before the timeline proceeds. Elias did not walk into a dealership to lease a depreciating liability. He walked into a bank to restructure his balance sheet. He executed a home equity line of credit, unlocking $500,000 of trapped capital. The interest rate felt manageable, the obligation felt structured, the extraction was clean, quiet, and deeply rational. He was not a reckless speculator chasing volatile returns. He deployed the extracted capital into a private commercial real estate syndication. The prospectus promised steady distributions backed by physical assets. The sector felt stable. The logic felt sound. He believed he was simply moving idle weight into a yielding environment. The syndication projected a double-digit annual yield. The bank demanded significantly less to service the borrowed equity. The spread looked effortless. External yield would pay internal debt and leave a predictable surplus. On his screen, everything aligned. There was no friction. He sat at his heavy dining room table, cool light reflecting off his laptop, watching the first distribution hit his account. The house had been converted from a static shelter into a working system. He believed he had optimized the structure. He did not see the invisible wire now attached to his foundation, tethering his family's physical safety directly to the performance of an external market. The notification arrived on the first of the month. $4,000 deposited into his account. 2 days later, the bank withdrew its share automatically. The payment cleared without friction. Nothing felt strained. Nothing felt risky. The system was working exactly as designed. Every month, the same rhythm repeated. Income arrived. Debt was serviced. A surplus remained. He did not have to work for it. He simply had to live inside the structure that generated it. For over a year, the cycle never broke. His spreadsheets stayed green, his stress stayed low, his confidence grew quietly, reinforced by perfect repetition. The house no longer felt like a liability. It felt productive. It felt efficient. It felt safe. He began to look at the structure differently, not as shelter, as an engine, a system that could be optimized further. The debt did not feel heavy because the yield always arrived first. The payments cleared automatically. The surplus accumulated quietly. The architecture of his life appeared balanced. In stable environments, leverage does not feel dangerous. It feels intelligent. When a system performs flawlessly long enough, the operator stops seeing exposure and starts seeing unused capacity. And that is when the structure begins to change. Elias stopped asking if it worked. He started asking how much further it could go. When a system works flawlessly, the brain stops seeing risk. It only sees unused capacity. A second commercial syndication opened, new capital accepted, limited slots. Elias did not hesitate. He returned to the bank and expanded his home equity line of credit, pulling an additional $300,000 from the walls around him. He told himself he was optimizing. He told himself he was increasing efficiency. The mechanism had proven itself. There was no reason to slow down. To reach full efficiency, he removed his final buffer. He drained his personal liquidity reserve and deployed it into the second fund. The move felt intelligent. It felt disciplined. It felt mathematically justified. It was irreversible. The architecture of his life was no longer conservative. It was fully leveraged. His physical shelter was now bolted directly to the velocity of an external market. As long as the yield flowed, the system would hold. If the yield paused, the structure would begin to feed on him. There was no safe step backward anymore. Exiting would crystallize losses large enough to damage the foundation permanently. The house was now carrying its maximum debt load. It was no longer a passive shelter. It had become an active financial participant, dependent on uninterrupted external income. The structure was optimized. The margin of safety was gone. From this point forward, the house was no longer an asset. It was an obligation that could not be paused. The structure has now shifted from optimization to exposure. Submit your structural diagnosis below. What is the primary flaw in Elias's architecture? The timeline narrows from here. The market did not collapse. There were no dramatic headlines. The commercial real estate sector simply cleared its throat and paused. Refinancing stalled. To preserve capital, the syndication manager quietly froze all monthly distributions. The emails were polite, rational, and devastating. The river of incoming yield simply stopped flowing. But gravity never negotiates with leverage. While the variable income vanished, the fixed obligation anchored to his home remained absolute. The bank did not care about frozen distributions. They required their $4,600 in interest on the 3rd of every month. The engine required continuous fuel. Without external yield, the machine turned inward. With his liquidity buffer already drained to maximize the second investment, Elias had only one source of capital left. He began redirecting his salary to service the debt tied directly to his own walls. He was no longer using the house to generate wealth. He was working to keep it from consuming him. The physical space transformed. The vaulted ceilings felt lower. The living room felt colder. The structure was no longer shelter. It was an obligation. No foreclosure, no crash, no panic, just the quiet procedural exhaustion of liquidity. The house remained. The cash did not. The structural fracture did not begin when the distributions paused. It began the day Elias converted a biological necessity into a leveraged obligation. He mistook equity for liquidity. Equity is theoretical. Liquidity is survival. By extracting capital from his foundation, he transformed a static shelter into a fixed monthly requirement. The amplification mechanism was simple and irreversible, a non-negotiable internal debt anchored to a variable external yield. The house did not betray him. The structure merely demanded consistency the market could not provide. Gravity never negotiates with leverage. When the external flow stopped, the internal obligation remained. He had engineered a system with no margin for interruption, assuming stable conditions would persist indefinitely. The walls survived the winter. His financial autonomy did not. The house never needed to generate income, it only needed to remain safe. He assigned it a different role. Additional case files remain archived. Maintain clearance within the system before this file is sealed. Case closed. The autopsy identified the fracture. The environment will test it again. The F.A.R. system, Financial Autopsy Resilience, was developed as a structural response model to the vulnerabilities documented in this file. Documentation is accessible below. Collapse repeats patterns. Defensive architecture remains procedural.